Are we still ought to believe that the rule of law is still practicing in Hong Kong under the absence of checks and balances within the three branches of government? If so, on what grounds?
It is a very difficult question to answer. At the time of this interview, in fact, we are witnessing the removal of the concept of separation of powers. Since the handover, it has been widely accepted that Hong Kong practices separation of powers. And over the past 23 years, nobody challenges it. In fact, from the courts, senior judges in various judgments cited there is separation of powers. To textbooks, students in Hong Kong understand and learn and accepted that there's separation of powers. To senior officials from the government make similar statements regarding the functions of the government. And so it came like a shock to basically everybody, from Carrie Lam, Chief Executive, to Teresa Jiang, Secretary for Justice, saying that everybody has been wrong. If they are trying to simply focus on the academic discussion, then that would be, of course, purely academic. But in Hong Kong, there's no such thing. I would say, or my fear is, I wonder whether they have something else on their agenda. That is, whether they want to challenge the independence of judiciary. Because this is not an independent incident. We have to look together with what has been going on in the past 2 or 3 weeks. Newspapers or media agency with a strong tie to the left, that is to the pro-Beijing camp, they basically name and shame individual judges who try different various criminal cases arising from the movement since last year. And these cases, some of them were acquitted. My concern is, in the old days, we would not see people, especially those in the media, would come out and be so aggressively targeting at individual judges and criticize cases, especially politically sensitive cases. But now we see that they have basically no self-control, as if there's a plan, and whether they have an ulterior motive against not only individual judges, but also the judiciary. And so the discussion should go beyond whether there's this concept or that. We have to go back to the fundamental issues, that is, whether independence of judiciary could be maintained in Hong Kong, especially when the Hong Kong government is trying to say there's no such thing as the separation of powers. And without separation of powers, independence of judiciary is just an empty promise. Who on earth is going to guarantee judges could be act and try cases independently? And so that strikes me the most.
Just to follow up from your response, from your legal background as a barrister, do you think the current Hong Kong common law system should be defined as rule by law instead of rule of law?
You know, the concept of common law is the fundamental element is independent judiciary. And of course, with a number of ingredients, then of course there's the rule of law. But right now, nobody with a reasonable mind would say the rule of law is functioning perfectly, especially when there are when the other branches of government, say the executive branch, is trying everything they could to undermine the rule of law, especially from the Secretary of Justice, who basically uses her discretion when it comes to prosecution in a very, very controversial way. And so it's dangerous, or let's put it this way, it's worrying that whether the usual understanding of the rule of law could continue and whether the common law in Hong Kong would be properly practiced as the way other jurisdictions do.
Thank you, Mr. Yeung, for your points of view on the rule of law and the judicial independence. We shall now move on to your political careers. Mr. Yeung, as an iconic pan-democrat, how would you view the new generation of radical activists or localists?
Well, it's just normal that the society has different voices, especially under whatever has been happening in Hong Kong. Not only since last year, but since I would say 2014, in the umbrella movement, when people crying for constitutional reforms, when people are demanding for more freedom, and in fact as promised under the basic law, that is universal suffrage to choose our chief executive and the full legislative council, but met with basically no positive response from those in powers. It just makes sense that people would go slightly more radical. And I used the movement last year as an example. To begin with, Hong Kong people took to the street peacefully. And what did we meet? Police brutality. And so things escalated. This is just natural for people to escalate their expectations and the way they conduct politics. And so I would say that's natural. And in fact, you look around the world, it's just the same. Hong Kong is not an exception in the world stage.
But how would you view some of the criticisms saying that they're disrupting the discipline of Hong Kong?
What do you mean by disrupting discipline? If those in power abuse powers, are they not the bigger wrongdoer? Are they not the ones who should be held fully responsible for disrupting Hong Kong, especially on the rule of law? Law and order, of course, is an important matter to a lot of people. But if we could have the wisdom to look beyond law and order, if we could look beyond what's happening on the street and try to understand what people are really thinking deep down, and the eagerness to cry for liberty, freedom, democracy, I mean, we would have a better understanding. And again, nobody, I would say, at least that's how I believe, would just choose to take to the street violently. I mean, this is not a natural response to anything. But there must be some foundations, and you have to look beyond what we see on the street. We have to try to understand the underlying reasons of everybody.
We will now discuss one of the hottest topics around the world, which is the national security law. Mr. Yeung, how do you draw the line between national security and freedom of speech?
Again, national security law was not passed by the local legislature. I have to remind the audience that the NSL did not even consult Hong Kong people. And so it came like overnight. And nobody really knew the details of the legislation before it was passed in Beijing. And basically, I would say the law was imposed on Hong Kong people without a choice. And so that is a complete contrary to the usual practice here in Hong Kong. No matter how controversial a piece of legislation is, at least in Hong Kong, the executive branch would, put forward the proposal to the people and try to consult people and try to consult the legislators, and we would have a proper debate, albeit just a debate here at the legislature, and we would vote for it. Although we understand eventually the result would be they would get what they wanted, but at least there's a so-called due process. But when it comes to NSL, we did not have any of those. It just happened overnight. Well, overnight is an exaggeration, but within a month or less, and all the cheerleaders from the pro-Beijing camp just came out and say, "Oh, it's a good piece of legislation. You don't have to understand the details, you just have to support it." I mean, this is fundamentally challenging everyone's sense of reasonableness in Hong Kong. And of course, if you look into the details of the legislation, we have reasonable grounds to suspect that it would be challenging our fundamental rights and freedoms, especially freedom of speech. We have seen cases since the law was passed on the 1st of July that people got arrested for holding up slogans that the authorities claim that it is illegal. But it has not been challenged in court, and it's not a court ruling. And the police would just basically use that statement issued by the government as a legal foundation for them to arrest people. And of course, that is problematic.
Speaking of freedom of speech, does the implementation of national security law mean that Hong Kong people no longer retain the right of contributing to dissenting opinions?
Well, the government said no. They said Hong Kong people still have all rights to say whatever you want, and the NSL only targeted at a small number of people. But we can just look at the news. We can see from the facts and make a judgment ourselves. I touched upon that a bit earlier in the last question, and my concern is, in the name of NSL, the authorities are trying to impose not only fear but self-censorship to a lot of people in Hong Kong. Not only politicians, not only activists, but also ordinary people. And God knows how far would they go. I mean, this is too early to make a full evaluation of the effect of the NSL. But so far, we have seen cases that ordinary people would get affected. And that goes way beyond what they claim, as an NSL only applies or targeted at a small group of people. Basically, I would say huge number of people, no matter who you are, would be subject to the law. And again, this is why I say it's problematic.
As your nomination has been ruled invalid, how would you view the political censorship, especially after the new implementation of national security law?
I would say this is not my disqualification of my candidacy would not stop on me, and we would expect more disqualifications on different candidates in the days to come. Although right now they postponed the election to next year, and I would be extremely surprised if they disqualify nobody next year. It's like a piece of tool that they have acquired from nowhere and use it so conveniently against people from the opposition camp, regardless whether you're radical or mild, or, relatively mild people got targeted at. I'm one of the examples. And again, my belief is, yes, they have the power to disqualify people, but yet as long as there's an election, Hong Kong people would make the right decision. They may not have to choose the ones they know. They could always elect people who they believe share the same political ideas. And so I would say, yes, you have your tools, you have your weapons, but we have our wisdom.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. The English section has finished.